Before we begin, listener, remember to gently tap like and subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Tonight, I'll take you through the quiet halls where the walls still breathe, where every sound means something, even when no one's there to make it. 5 stories, each one a whisper left behind by those who never truly left. So, turn down the lights, lie still, and listen carefully. Because some sounds don't stop when you wake up. Story 1. The envelope that keeps returning. I had been living in the cabin for nearly 3 months when the first envelope arrived. It was lying neatly on the wooden step outside my door, pale against the moss dartboards, as if someone had placed it there only moments before I opened the door. The forest was still, wrapped in a faint morning mist, and not even the birds had broken the silence. Yet, when I bent down to pick it up, I heard it, the faintest rustle of paper, as though the envelope itself had moved. Inside, nothing but a single blank sheet. That would have been forgettable if the sound hadn't followed me back inside. A soft, deliberate shuff, like fingertips turning pages close to my ear. Though the cabin was empty and the windows shut, I remember holding my breath, listening to the quiet crackle of paper from nowhere, unsure whether it came from the envelope or from the walls around me. The air felt too still, too expectant, and when I looked at the blank sheet again, I realized it wasn't quite blank. There were faint markings, like indent lines, as though someone had written on the other side, but the page had only one side, and the rustling was getting closer. The rustling didn't stop after that morning. If anything, it grew bolder, appearing at moments when silence should have been absolute. The cabin was small, built from old timber that carried sound strangely. Every crack and shift of the wood echoed like a whisper. Yet the noise I heard wasn't wood settling. It was unmistakably paper. Thin, dry, moving with intention. That was when the second envelope appeared. I found it at dusk, resting on the same step as before. The forest around the cabin had turned darker, almost blue, and the last threads of daylight filtered through the trees like thin curtains. I remember freezing halfway down the steps, because I could hear it already shh, shh. But this time, it wasn't faint. It was steady, as though someone was flipping through a book just behind my right shoulder. I didn't turn. I don't know why. Perhaps some instinct warned me not to look. I picked up the envelope instead, and the sound stopped instantly, like a held breath. Inside was another sheet, not blank this time, though no ink touched its surface. Instead, the page was full of shallow grooves, like someone had pressed a pen hard enough to leave the shape of words without any pigment. I tilted it toward the lamp inside the cabin, and as the shadows revealed the indentations, I realized the message wasn't written in straight lines. It spiraled inward, forming a tightening coil of pressure marks. The final indentation at the center looked deeper than the others, as though the writer's hand had trembled. Still unreadable, still silent, until I placed the sheet on the table. Then the rustling erupted again, right beneath my hand. I snatched my fingers back. The page lay still, but the sound continued, circling the cabin, brushing past the walls, slipping under the door frames. It had rhythm now, hesitant, searching, as if it were trying to locate something or someone. I stepped away from the table, my heartbeat slowly matching the cadence of the noise. Something was wrong with the air, too thin, too dry, like a room sealed for years. I I found myself staring at the door, half expecting the third envelope to be slid under it at any moment. But the forest outside remained motionless. When the rustling finally faded, I realized I hadn't taken a full breath in nearly a minute. And just as I exhaled, a single thought surfaced quiet. Unwelcome. What if the sound wasn't following the envelopes? What if the envelopes were following the sound? A soft tap landed on the window beside me. One tap, then another. Slow. Testing. The papers on the table shivered. The tapping on the window should have been easy to dismiss branches. Insects. The cooling of the glass. But it didn't behave like any of those things. It paused when I moved, resumed only when I stilled. 3 taps. A pause. 2 taps. A longer pause. Then a single, deliberate knock that made the envelope on the table tremble as though responding. I stood frozen in the center of the cabin, listening. The forest outside was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as though the whole landscape were holding its breath with me. The tapping ceased, replaced by something far worse, the soft, unmistakable sound of paper shifting underneath the door. I watched a thin white corner slide forward across the wooden floorboards slowly, patiently, as if being fed into the cabin by invisible fingers. The third envelope. I didn't pick it up at first. Instead, I crouched, watching the envelope rest there. The silence dragged on, dense and heavy, and then the rustling began again, but not around the room this time. It came from inside the envelope, a delicate fluttering like wings beating against the paper walls. The noise swelled, filling the small cabin with a frantic trembling. The sheets on the table vibrated, tapping against the wood in short, rapid bursts. Every sound had grown sharper, clearer, as though the forest itself funneled its quiet into the cabin and left only the scratching, shifting, whispering of paper. I reached for the envelope not to open it, but simply to stop whatever was thrashing inside. But the moment my fingers brushed its surface, the rustling stopped. Instantly. Completely. The cabin fell into a silence so sudden it felt violent. I opened the envelope with slow, careful breaths. Inside, another single sheet, again filled with indent lines shaped by a heavy pen. But this one was different. The indentations weren't spirals or random curves. They traced a narrow, winding path from the top of the page to the bottom, like a line meant to be followed by a fingertip. When I tilted it toward the lamp, the indent mark seemed deeper near the bottom, almost gouged. And at the very end of the path, there was a shape small, precise, a tiny square, a door. I touched the center of the page lightly. The paper was warm. Then the sound returned. Not rustling this time, not even tapping. It was breathing. Slow, shallow breaths coming from the direction of the front door. My own breath caught in my throat, and I listened, counting the seconds between each inhale. 1, 2, 3, inhale. 1, 2, 3, exhale. But the breaths didn't belong to me. They were too controlled, too steady, too close. I edged backward until my shoulder met the wall. The wooden boards were cool under my palms, grounding me just long enough to break through the rising panic. The breathing shifted, moving toward the window, then toward the table, then toward the door again, as though circling, searching for the right place to stand. I dared not move. The sheet in my hand seemed to tremble, or perhaps it was my fingers. The breathing stopped. The cabin held its silence for a full 5 seconds. Then, the fourth envelope dropped through the slot in the door with a soft, final whisper. One I felt more than heard. A whisper that slid along the floorboards like a blade made of paper. And for the first time, I realized something. The envelopes weren't arriving at random. They were arriving closer together. Whatever was delivering them was getting nearer. Or braver. Or both. And it was no longer trying to hide its presence. The fourth envelope lay just inside the doorway, its white surface catching the lamplight like a small, waiting eye. I didn't move toward it at once. The air in the cabin had turned heavy again, dry, papery, filled with the faint static of something listening. I could almost sense the shape of a presence beyond the door. Not quite visible, not quite gone. I took a slow breath and stepped forward. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the sound felt too loud, as though it didn't belong in this place anymore. The presence on the other side of the door seemed to react. I heard a faint shift, like a foot or something shaped like one adjusting its stance. I crouched and touched the envelope. Warm. Not warm like fingertips. Warm like breath. The moment I lifted it, the entire cabin reacted. The papers on the table rustled violently, swirling in place like trapped birds. The page with the carved winding path slapped itself flat against the wood. Even the blank first sheet quivered, all of them tugging toward the unopened envelope in my hand. As though connected, I forced myself to open it slowly. The flap peeled away with a soft tearing sound that echoed far too loudly. Inside was another sheet, but this one was different again. Its indent lines were deeper than any before, carved with such force that the page bowed slightly inward. The writing was jagged, erratic, as though the hand that made it trembled uncontrollably. I tilted it toward the lamplight. This time, the words were readable. I can hear you. My fingers stiffened. For a moment, I thought the message addressed some future version of me, the one recorded in those impossible predictions. But then I felt it, an exhale against the back of my neck. Not a breeze, not a draft, a breath. I turned. The cabin was empty, but not silent. A low, whispering rustle swelled from the far corner paper, dragging slowly across wood. I stepped backward, holding the sheet in front of me like a shield. The sound grew louder, rising to a soft frenzy, and as my eyes adjusted, I realized the scrap of paper wasn't moving on its own. Something underneath it was. The page bulged upward, pushed from below, as though a fingertip traced the underside. Then another page slid across the floor toward it, twitching with tiny spasms. Then another, and another. The envelopes, still sealed, began to quiver upright, their corners lifting from the ground. A trail was forming, leading toward me. The whispering grew sharper, thousands of tiny frictions of paper rubbing, scraping, folding. I backed toward the center of the room, pulse hammering in my throat. The papers followed, crawling over one another in a slow wave, forming a narrow path that pointed straight to my feet. Then everything stopped. The rustling ceased as if cut away by a blade. Silence swallowed the room. A single sheet slid out from the mass, separating itself. It lay at my feet, face down. I kneeled, hesitating, fingers trembling as I flipped it over. More indent lines, more spirals, more impossible writing. But this time, the message was short, almost impatient. Turn around. I froze. My breath hitched. The silence felt alive, coiled, expectant. I didn't want to turn. I didn't want to confirm what the message implied, that something stood there, inches behind me, close enough to write on a page through sheer pressure of presence. But the room left me no choice. The papers began to rise slowly, lifting from the floor as if pulled by invisible threads. They hovered at eye level, trembling, pointing their edges toward the space behind me like arrows. I gathered what was left of my courage and turned. At first, I saw nothing, just the door, slightly ajar, the forest beyond dark and deep. But there was something wrong with the shadows. A shape darker than darkness itself. A narrow silhouette, like the outline of a person standing against the wood, unmoving, featureless. Then it leaned forward, not walking, not stepping, just bending toward me, as though its weight were made of air and its form was paper thin. A sound came from it, a single, deep inhalation, drawn long and deliberate. Breathing me in, the papers crashed to the floor around my feet. The silhouette didn't move after that inhalation. It simply held its shape against the door, as if waiting for something I couldn't see. I stayed frozen, the echo of that breath lingering inside my ribs like a borrowed pulse. When I finally dared to blink, the shape thinned, flattening ever so slightly until it dissolved into the shadow of the doorframe. Gone, as if it had never been there. For several seconds, I didn't move. The cabin remained silent, save for the settling sigh of wood. The scattered papers lay motionless on the floor, no longer twitching or pulling toward one another. Even the air felt different, lighter, released from the tension that had been tightening it for hours. I found myself breathing properly again, slower, steadier. Relief crept in carefully, like something testing the edges of the room. I closed the door fully, locking it out of habit despite knowing it would make no real difference. The faint click of the latch sounded ordinary, comfortingly mundane. When I turned back, the cabin looked like a place I had always known quiet, safe, faintly glowing in the warm lamplight. For the first time since the envelopes began arriving, I felt a kind of fragile calm. I knelt to gather the papers, stacking them neatly on the table. None of them reacted. No rustling, no trembling, just inert sheets of indented text and blank grooves. Whatever had animated them before seemed to have retreated with the shadow at the door. Maybe it was over. Maybe confronting it, looking directly at whatever had been standing there, had broken whatever spell connected it to the envelopes. The thought was absurd, but oddly comforting. I poured myself a small cup of water, hands shakier than I wanted to admit, and sat down at the table. The cabin's soft warmth pressed against my shoulders like a familiar blanket. The lamp hummed faintly. The silence was no longer charged with threat. It felt restful, almost heavy, like a night that wanted me to sleep. Even the fourth envelope, still lying open beside me, seemed emptied of menace. I unfolded the sheet inside again, tracing the indentations with a cautious fingertip. "I can hear you." The words no longer felt like a warning, just an echo of something that had already passed. By the time I exhaled, I almost felt foolish for my earlier fear. Creatures of imagination could become dangerously convincing in isolation. Forest nights played tricks on the mind. My own uncertainty could have woven terror into the shapes of trees and shadows. I told myself that again and again. Even so, the cabin felt oddly still. Not threatening, just expectant, as though the room were listening to my thoughts. I stood and checked the windows, then drew the curtains closed. The forest was too dark now, impossibly dark, and I didn't want to see anything standing beyond the glass. When I stepped back inside, the soft glow of the lamp made the space feel small and safe again. The quiet reassured me, until I noticed something. The first 3 envelopes, which I had placed on the table earlier, were now arranged in a perfect row side by side, edges aligned with unnatural precision. I hadn't done that. I knew I hadn't. But the sight of them didn't fill me with terror this time. Instead, it struck me like a strange gesture of peace. A tidying, a closing act, almost a reassurance. My heartbeat settled a little. Maybe the presence had simply finished whatever it wanted. Maybe the confrontation was the end of it. The air felt gentler. My limbs felt heavier. The cabin felt like a place I could finally rest. I was just about to extinguish the lamp when I saw it. Something small, pale, and new. A 5th envelope. It hadn't been there a moment ago. I was certain. But there it lay on the center of the table, placed directly on top of the arranged row, as if completing a set. And unlike the others, this one wasn't sealed. Its flap was open. Inside, the page was blank, completely blank. No indent lines. No spirals. No messages etched from another hand. But as I lifted it, the page suddenly warmed, and faint impressions rose to its surface like breath on glass, forming a single, unfinished sentence. You turned around too soon. The rest of the line was missing, or erased, or still being written. Somewhere behind me, the floorboard shifted. The floorboard behind me didn't creak like wood. It flexed slow, deliberate under a weight too evenly distributed to be a footstep. My breath caught halfway up my throat, refusing to go in or out. The unfinished sentence on the warm page trembled between my fingers. You turned around too soon. The implication struck me like a slow, cold blade. Whatever had stood behind me before whatever silhouette had inhaled the air from my lungs. It wasn't done, and I had looked too early, interrupted something. The floorboard flexed again. A second, deeper bowing of timber. I could feel the pressure through the soles of my feet, as though something was testing the boundaries of the room. The cabin's stillness no longer felt calm. It pulsed, shallow and quick, like a creature trying not to reveal it was awake. Without turning, I placed the unfinished page back on the table, slow enough to avoid any sudden sound. My fingertips tingled when they left it. The page continued to warm. I moved toward the lantern, intending to snuff it. Darkness felt safer now, less visible, less exposed. But as I reached out, a soft shift spiraled around me. Pages, hundreds of minute movements, like the papers on the table were inhaling. I looked down. They were rising again, not violently this time, gently, almost reverently, lifting themselves into the air with slow, drifting motions, circling the table like tiny white moths. The envelopes followed, sliding upright and tilting, pointing their open mouths toward the center of the room, and then they faced the same direction, toward me. A breeze touched the back of my neck, not cold, not warm, but textured, like the ghost of fingertips brushing upward across my spine. I turned, and this time, the silhouette did not hide. It stood in the middle of the cabin, a tall, narrow distortion as though the space behind it had been folded and pressed into the shape of a person. Its edges fluttered faintly, like loose pages caught in a breath of wind. Where its face should have been, The shadows curved inward too dark, too deep, like a hollow carved from absence. It leaned forward again, closer, closer, as though it meant to rest its weight on my chest. The papers around us rustled sharply, turning in unison to face the shape. Their corners pointed like 100 little quills. Some hovered closer, drawn toward the hollow-faced figure as though waiting for command. Its chest expanded, a long inhale, and the pages responded. They surged toward me, fluttering, shivering, pressing around my arms and shoulders like a gathering storm. They didn't grab or cut, but guided, nudged, pushed, coaxing me backward, away from the silhouette. It wasn't attacking me. It was directing me. I stumbled toward the door as the papers pressed at my back. The silhouette shifted, gliding soundlessly to block the path, not to trap me, but to watch. Its hollow face dipped downward, as though examining the pages swirling around me. Then another noise broke through. A thump. A low, resonant impact. Not from inside the cabin. From beneath it, the floorboards trembled with a heavy, rhythmic pulse. Another thump, then another. 3 heartbeats, each louder than the last. The pages reacted instantly, scattering upward, forming a trembling cloud around my head. The silhouette's body tightened, its edges folding inward as though bracing. A 4th thump rippled through the cabin, followed by a long, dragging sound beneath the floor. Not a creature's movement, not an animal. More like something heavy being pulled across the underside of the boards. Something shaped like... No, I wouldn't let myself think it. The silhouette raised its head, and for the first time, it moved toward me with purpose. Not gliding, not floating, striding its thin, folding limbs whispering against the walls as it passed. The air around it thinned, as though space were bending to make room for something too narrow and too tall. It approached the door and stopped, waiting. The meaning was unmistakable. Leave. My pulse hammered in my ears. I grabbed the lantern, snatched my coat, and pushed through the door. The night outside swallowed me with a chill that clung to my skin like wet moss. Behind me, the cabin pulsed one last time with the sound of shifting paper, then silence. I ran. Branches whipped at my face. Roots tried to catch my feet. The forest seemed almost rearranged, as though the path twisted with each step, but the night was loud alive, with distant rustling, not behind me, but around me, guiding me left, then right, then down a slope. The envelopes weren't following. The forest was... When I reached the tree line at the edge of the clearing, I collapsed to my knees, lungs burning. The cabin was barely visible through the branches, and as I watched, the silhouette stepped into the doorway. Its shape filled the frame, thin and tall, made of wind and paper and something too old to name. It raised one arm, not to reach me, not to call me back, to drop something, a 6th envelope. It landed softly at the threshold. The silhouette stepped backward into the darkness of the cabin, folding out of sight like a page shutting on itself. The forest held its breath. I knew, without opening it, without touching it, that the message inside the 6th envelope wasn't written for the cabin. It was written for the road leading away from it. And for me, running would not make me safe. Not anymore. I didn't dare approach the 6th envelope. Even from the tree line, I could see it clearly, its surface faintly stirring. as though something inside was shifting, adjusting, breathing. The cold night air pressed around me, thick with the quiet of a forest that was no longer a forest, but an audience. My legs trembled as I stood. I wanted to walk away, to put my back to the cabin and let the darkness swallow the path behind me. But a soft crack broke the stillness, a twig snapping under no weight I could see. Then another, each one closer, each one deliberate. The forest was urging me to move. So I did. I backed away from the clearing, one slow step at a time, keeping my eyes fixed on the cabin door. The silhouette did not return. Nothing shifted in the windows. Only the envelope waited, open-mouthed, like a trap built from paper and breath. When I finally dared to turn toward the road, the wind shifted gentle at first, then funneled sharply past my ear like a whisper trying to catch up. Something brushed my ankle. I froze. A thin white shape lay against my boot. An envelope, not the sixth one, a seventh. Its flap was sealed, but my name was pressed into it, not handwritten, but indented, as if the page had been bitten. My heartbeat thudded painfully through my ribs. I bent down, picked it up, and felt the faint movement inside. A soft shifting, like a tiny body turning over in sleep. I should have thrown it away, left it, run. But the envelope warmed instantly in my hand, as if recognizing me. Then a faint tap sounded on the back of the paper once, twice, 3 times, matching the rhythm of footsteps approaching from behind. I turned. The forest path was empty, but the tapping continued inside the envelope, faster now, like fingers drumming impatiently. I lifted the flap with shaking hands. Inside was a single line, pressed so deeply into the fiber that the page nearly tore. You didn't escape. I'm traveling with you now. A breeze curled past my left ear close, intimate, like a mouth leaning in. And then the rustling began again, from somewhere impossibly near. Story 2. The Forgotten Observatory. I first saw the observatory on a night when the clouds were thin enough for the stars to breathe through. It sat alone at the cliff's highest edge, its domed roof tilted slightly, as though listening to the wind that rushed endlessly across the stone. I had been assigned to inspect the old equipment, nothing more than a formality, they said. Just a building too old to trust and too remote to care about. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt as though I had interrupted something mid-sentence. The air was cold, sharper than the night outside, carrying a faint metallic echo that didn't match any machine I knew. Dust covered nearly everything except the telescope. Its long brass body gleamed as if someone had polished it recently, and the gears at its base twitched softly, turning a few millimeters at a time. I approached it slowly, boots crunching over old stone tiles. Each step echoed upward into the dome, returning with a faint delay, as though something above me were echoing back a little too deliberately. Then the telescope moved on its own, rotating with a slow creak until its lens pointed not at the sky, but toward the small square window behind me. And from that direction came a soft losh-kosh, like fingers adjusting a focus ring in the dark. I didn't turn toward the window immediately. Something about the sound, those tiny, careful losh-kosh clicks felt too controlled, too measured to belong to any creature. They came in short clusters, each one precise, as though whoever or whatever made them was adjusting something that required patience. I stepped closer to the telescope instead, placing my hand lightly on the brass tube. It was warm, not with the residual heat of machinery, but with the subtle pulse of something that had been touched only moments ago. The gears inside gave a soft whir, shifting the lens upward by barely a degree. A second lash cache came from the window, then another, then silence. I finally turned. The small square window was no larger than a sheet of paper, fixed into the stone wall opposite the telescope. Its glass was opaque with age, frosted by salt carried on the wind from the sea far below. Nothing outside could be seen, only the distorted hint of darkness pressing against it. Yet the clicks had definitely come from there. I walked toward it slowly. As I approached, the temperature changed just slightly, but enough that I felt a thin current of cold air passing across my face. There was no draft in the observatory, no broken seals, no reason for the window to breathe. My footsteps echoed around the dome with an odd hollowness, as though the shape of the room were bending the sound back toward me. I reached the window and placed my palm against the glass. It throbbed. A faint vibration pulsed through it, steady at first, then fading. I pressed my ear to it, holding my breath, and there, faint as a lullaby from underwater, I heard it. Click, click, click. Not random, not mechanical. A rhythm, an intentional one. I stepped back quickly, heart hammering against my ribs. The telescope behind me gave a soft groan as its lens shifted again, not toward the stars, but toward me, tracking my movement with a hesitant jerk of metal. It wasn't pointing toward the window anymore. It was pointing at the back of my head. I turned slowly, expecting, hoping to find some explanation in the gears or the mounting. Instead, I saw the telescope aligned perfectly with me, its dark, circular eye fixed in my direction like a pupil widening in dim light. The dome above creaked. Once, a long, drawn-out sigh of stone and metal. The observatory was reacting, listening, observing. I stepped away from the window, but the moment I moved, the telescope followed smooth this time, almost eager. Its base swiveled with a soft mechanical rumble, tracking my steps with unnatural precision. And then the lach-kach sound returned, this time not from the window. It came from directly behind the telescope, from a small service hatch in the wall, a hatch I hadn't noticed before, a hatch no one had mentioned. The metal cover trembled, once, twice, as though something behind it was trying to adjust the world on the other side. I froze. The telescope tilted upward, then down again, as if nodding toward the hatch, inviting me, or warning me. I took a hesitant step closer. The air thickened, pressing around my shoulders like unseen hands. The hatch's screws clicked one by one, turning slowly, as if loosened from within. Whatever waited in that wall knew I was here. The first screw fell from the hatch with a soft metallic tink, rolling across the stone floor in a slow, lazy arc. I followed its path with my eyes, but my ears were fixed on the hatch, on the steady, deliberate clicking of the remaining screws as they turned one by one from the inside. The telescope gave a soft jerk, as if startled by the noise, then leaned slightly toward the hatch, its lens lowering like a creature bowing its head to drink. The dome above groaned, a long reverberation that settled into a low hum, almost a resonance, as though the entire structure were tuning itself. The air thickened again. The second screw dropped, then the third. Each fall echoed too loudly, bouncing off the curved walls with a sharpness out of proportion to their size. When the final screw loosened, it didn't fall. It clicked into place and hung there, suspended by tension, held by something unseen behind the panel. Then the hatch inhaled, a deep, dry breath, as though the space behind it were expanding for the first time in years. Dust trickled from the edges. The metal bowed outward, ever so slightly, straining against an invisible force. I stepped back, but only once, anymore, and I was certain the telescope would follow with that unsettling eagerness it had already shown. Even now, its gears whirred lightly, adjusting the lens angle so it stared directly at the hatch's center point, almost as if the observatory were trying to see through the metal, or see whatever was pushing against it. Lach-kach, lach-kach, lach-kach. Rapid now. Frenzied. Not a methodical adjustment anymore, but the feverish turning of something impatient on the other side of the wall. The hatch bulged. Once. Twice. Each time with a dull thud that vibrated through the old stone tiles, rattling dust loose from the ceiling. Then everything stopped. Not quite stopped. Sound itself seemed to thin out, stretched to the point of breaking. My breath felt loud enough to shatter the moment. Even the wind outside muted, as though the cliff and sea were holding themselves still. A single sharp click pierced the silence. Then the hatch popped open, not swung, not forced, the way a held breath escapes between teeth. A narrow slip of darkness appeared, thin as a crack in old parchment, and a cold rush of air flowed out around my legs. It smelled faintly of metal and damp stone, but also something else, something like dust, warmed by body heat. I leaned forward, heart hammering, peering into the narrow gap. At first, I saw nothing, just darkness, a hollow space beyond the wall, too cramped for a person, too deliberate to be accidental. Then I heard it, a sound that rose from that darkness like a thread being pulled. Click, 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 click. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't human. It was the sound of teeth. Small, close, adjusting themselves in rhythmic, searching taps. I stumbled backward, hitting the base of the telescope. Its gears screeched softly, reacting to my weight, and the lens snapped upward like a startled eye. The clicking inside the wall intensified, erupting into a sudden flurry, the frantic testing of something trying to widen the opening. The hatch jumped on its hinges. The remaining strip of metal bent outward. A sliver of movement flickered behind it. Thin, pale, jointed in too many places. The telescope slammed itself sideways, crashing into its own mount. The dome reverberated like thunder, shaking dust and fragments of old plaster onto the floor. Every object in the room seemed to tremble with the same instinct I felt rising in my chest. Do not let it come through. I lunged at the hatch without thinking, slamming my body weight against it. The metal seared cold against my palms, and something behind it reacted instantly, pressing back with a dry, frantic tapping, like fingers drumming in irritation. The hatch vibrated violently. The clicking rose to a deafening pitch, echoing through the observatory with such force that the telescope's lens shattered inward, scattering fragments across the floor like jagged stars. For a moment, I felt the thing behind the wall push, hard, as though testing the strength of the barrier and of me. Then the pressure eased. The sound receded, slowly, reluctantly. The hatch settled back into place with a soft thud that felt almost disappointed. I staggered away from it, shaking, breath coming in ragged bursts. The telescope lay slumped on its mount like a creature that had exhausted itself protecting me. But the worst part wasn't the clicking, or the hatch, or the glimpse of that pale, jointed limb. It was the realization, clear as the stars above the dome. Whatever was behind that wall wasn't trapped. It had simply been waiting, and now it knew exactly where to find me. I kept my distance from the hatch, though distance meant very little in a room that suddenly felt too small for breath to move. The shattered fragments of the telescope lens glittered across the floor like splinters of frozen light. Each one reflected the same trembling truth. I wasn't alone in the observatory. I had never been alone here. The air trembled with a low vibration, like a sound too deep for hearing, more felt than perceived. The hatch, though closed again, pulsed faintly, as if the darkness behind it were exhaling. The metal curved inward for the briefest moment, then relaxed. A slow, steady rhythm. Breathing. I stepped backward, careful not to crunch the lens fragments underfoot. Even small sounds felt dangerous, too sharp, too revealing. The dome above held the silence loosely, like a thin membrane stretched to breaking. Then the wind outside shifted. A long, rolling gust pressed against the observatory walls, and the small window, the one the telescope had pointed at earlier, vibrated with a muffled hum. A thin line of cold air slipped through the glass edges, brushing the side of my face, and with it came a new sound. Not clicking, not breathing, scraping, something dragging over stone. Slowly, I turned toward the window. A shadow passed across it. Not a branch, not an animal. It was too deliberate, too smooth, gliding past in a single, uninterrupted motion. The frost on the pane quivered, bending inward, as if pulled by a gravity just outside. The scraping continued around the dome's exterior, circling the observatory at an unhurried pace. It tracked the curve of the wall like fingertips gliding across the skin of a drum. I pressed myself against the inner stone column of the telescope mount, letting the cold seep into my back. My pulse throbbed against the collar of my coat. I knew that sound. It was the same measured adjustment I'd heard inside the wall, but larger now. Louder, no longer confined. Whatever had been behind the hatch had moved. The scraping paused directly behind the window. Everything stilled. Then, click. A single, sharp sound tapped against the outside glass. Once, twice, 3 times. The same rhythm it had used behind the hatch. I held my breath. The glass bulged inward with a soft creak, bending impossibly under the pressure. Frost cracked in spiderweb patterns. A pale outline pressed against it, a shape like the side of a face, but too flat, too smooth, as though something were adjusting itself to look inward without understanding how to form features. The clicking grew rapid, impatient, then the pressure vanished. The shape slid away from the window and resumed circling the building, scraping and tapping in a slow downward spiral like it was searching for an entrance. My eyes darted toward the hatch, still shut, but pulsing faintly. Then the telescope twitched. Its ruined lens was shattered, but the brass body lifted itself with a protesting groan, gears grinding painfully. It angled toward the window first instinctively, protectively, then swung sharply toward the hatch, as though torn between threats. And then it pointed at me, not as an attack, a warning. I barely had time to register that thought before the hatch exploded outward. The metal flaps snapped open like a jaw, slamming against the wall with a scream of iron. A long, jointed limb shot out, pale and segmented like the appendage of some vast insect, each segment clicking as it bent. It swept across the floor in a wide arc, searching, tasting the air for movement. I scrambled backward, slipping on the shattered lens pieces. The limb twisted sharply toward the sound, toward me, its pointed tip snapping inward like a hinge. The telescope lurched forward, throwing its weight into the limb, smashing the metal tube against it. The impact rang through the observatory, echoing like a struck bell. The limb recoiled, clawing back into the hatch with furious staccato clicking. But the victory didn't last. I heard a low, resonant groan rise from beneath the floor. Then a sharp pop from the far side of the observatory. The stones shifted under my feet. More hatches, more openings, more ways in. The wind outside roared suddenly, shaking the dome. Dust rained from the ceiling. The scraping sound accelerated, sliding around the walls in a frantic loop. The observatory was surrounded. The thing behind the hatch had help. The telescope strained upward again, turning to face the main door, as if signaling the only escape. The clicking behind the walls intensified, multiplying. 1, 2, 3, 4 sources. 5, all converging. The limb from the hatch thrust out again, this time not searching, reaching. It swept across the floor with furious precision, dragging the lens shards aside like dry leaves. The tip curled toward my ankle. I ran. The door shuddered under my hand. The wind outside nearly tore it from its hinges. Behind me, the limb slammed into the floorboards, splintering them in a burst of dust. The door flew open. Cold air hit my face like a slap, and as I sprinted onto the cliffside platform, I heard it, a chorus of clicking, emerging from every wall, every crack, every seam of the observatory, closing in. The wind hit me with such force that for a moment I thought it might push me straight off the cliff. I staggered forward, gripping the rusted railing that bordered the stone platform. The observatory loomed behind me, its dome vibrating with muffled clicking and scraping, an entire hive of movement sealed inside stone and steel. But out here, in the open, the night felt almost merciful. The sky stretched wide and starless. The sea far below roared with a steady rhythm, and the wind's howl drowned out every unnatural sound leaking from the observatory. Each breath I took tasted of salt and cold, human sensations, familiar sensations. For a few seconds, I allowed myself to believe it, that I had outrun whatever lived behind those hatches, that the open air made me unreachable. The thought soothed me enough that I released the railing. When I turned back, the observatory door was still open, swinging on its hinges. No limbs reached out, no silhouettes formed, not even a shadow moved inside. Only the faint hum of metal cooling, as if the room were settling back into its derelict quiet. The clicking had stopped, entirely. The silence felt like a gift. I stepped toward the door cautiously, trying to look inside without getting close enough for the darkness to swallow me. The telescope lay collapsed at an angle, its brass frame twisted from the impact of its last desperate strike. Nothing stirred. Maybe the things inside couldn't leave. Maybe the observatory was part of some containment system, old, forgotten, but still effective. The wind softened. My heartbeat steadied. The terror receded enough for fatigue to seep in, heavy and warm. I should leave. I told myself I should run down the cliff path, call someone, anyone, but another thought crept in, quieter, unwelcome, yet strangely logical. If the creatures had wanted to tear through the door, they would have. If they had wanted to follow me onto the cliff, nothing had stopped them. But they didn't, which meant the danger might have been less than, and more where I had been standing. I took a slow step closer to the observatory, peering at its doorway again. The darkness inside was deep, unnaturally so, but not moving or breathing or clicking. Calm, empty. The wind shifted, brushing the side of my face like a gentle reassurance. "You're safe," it seemed to whisper. I let out a long breath and leaned a hand against the doorframe. Bad idea. Something cold touched my fingers light. Delicate, almost polite. Not a grab, not an attack. A greeting. I jerked my hand back, but the sensation clung to my skin like a lingering echo. I looked down. Nothing. Just my own hand, pale in the moonlight, trembling. The wind gusted again, this time blowing into the observatory. Dust rose in a harmless cloud. I watched closely, heart pounding, but the dust drifted through the air normally. Nothing disturbed it. Another sign, another small, beautiful sign that the danger was gone. And then I saw the telescope's frame move. Not much, just a settling of weight, a tiny adjustment. Metal does that, I told myself. Structures shift, gravity pulls. I told myself again when the frame twitched a second time, and a third. Then it lifted, barely, a fraction, as if something beneath it was stretching, testing the weight. My breath froze mid-inhale. The telescope's shadow elongated across the floor in a way that didn't match the lantern light still burning faintly inside. The shadow curled toward the door, toward me. I stumbled back off the threshold, nearly losing my footing on the stone platform. The door swung a little wider as the wind caught it again, but the interior remained still. No limb, no clicking, no scraping, no pale face pressed to the dark. Just the telescope shadow, reaching. Then the wind shifted again, this time rushing past me and into the observatory in a sudden, violent gust, and the shadow snapped back into place, like a leash yanked tight. Silence fell. A silence too exact, too deliberate. I realized with a creeping sense of dread that the wind wasn't trying to reassure me. It had been trying to warn me. I backed away again, heading toward the cliff path. The observatory door hung open behind me like a mouth fixed in a patient smile. As I took one final step backward, a faint noise rose from inside. Not clicking, not scraping. A slow, careful adjusting sound, as though something inside were preparing for a second attempt. The adjusting sound deepened soft at first, like the faint shift of metal settling under its own weight. But then it grew deliberate, purposeful. Click, click, click. Slow, measured, as though something inside were aligning itself with a new target. Me. The wind gusted hard against my back, urging me toward the cliff path. But I couldn't bring myself to turn fully. My legs moved one step, then another. But my eyes remained fixed on the open observatory door. The adjusting noises multiplied. One set of clicks, then a second, then a third, higher pitched like a smaller gear, or a smaller joint, all synchronizing. The dark inside the observatory shifted. Not a movement I could see, but a thickening and increase of depth, of shape, as though more than one presence had turned its attention toward the doorway. The shadows rearranged themselves. The wind pushed again, harder this time, almost desperate. That was when the first limb emerged. It came slowly, too slowly, sliding along the floor like a long, jointed quill made of pale stone. Its segments clicked softly as they extended, one after another, adjusting angles with perfect precision. The limb stopped just short of the threshold, as if testing the boundary between inside and out. It hovered there, waiting. I backed away further down the stone platform, pressing my shoulder against the cold cliff wall. The limb reacted instantly, rising a few degrees, tracking the motion with careful interest. Then a second limb unfolded from the hatch inside. Then a third, oblong, pale, segmented, each one adjusting itself with that same delicate click, 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 like instruments tuning to a frequency only they understood. They didn't rush toward me. Instead, they positioned themselves around the doorway, three limbs angled outward. One angled low, one angled high, forming a kind of frame, a viewing frame. I understood then. The way the telescope had followed me, the way the hatch had opened exactly when I leaned near, the way the window had pulsed like a lens being tested. They weren't only hunting, they were observing, studying the way light reflected off me, the way I moved, the way I breathed. And now, after all their adjustments, they were ready. The limbs withdrew in unison, fluid and silent. The darkness behind them deepened, drawing inward as though something were inhaling the very shape of the room. The observatory's lantern flickered once, twice, then extinguished with a soft sigh. Everything inside went black. The wind died abruptly, leaving the night shockingly still. Then the clicking returned, and this time, it wasn't inside the observatory. It was behind me. I spun too fast, nearly losing my footing on the uneven stone path. At first I saw nothing, just the cliffside stretching into darkness. But then a faint glint caught the moonlight. A limb, not emerging from the observatory, not reaching through a hatch, but rising slowly from the cliff face itself, joint by joint, like something climbing up from below. Another glint, another limb, both adjusting, both calibrating. A third limb hooked itself over the edge of the platform with a soft clack, pulling something upward, something still hidden by shadow, but unmistakably large. My breath caught. Escape was no longer optional. It was the only remaining instinct left alive. I bolted down the cliff path. The stone under my boots was slick with sea spray, and the descent was steep, twisting between jagged boulders. Each step sent small rocks skittering down the slope, echoing into the vastness below. Behind me, the clicking multiplied, high-pitched, low-pitched, near, far, all converging. I didn't dare look back until the wind returned, slamming into me from the side, nearly knocking me off the path. It howled through the rocks with a wild, keening pitch, almost like a warning scream. I grabbed a jutting branch for balance and turned just enough to see the observatory silhouetted above. And what climbed out of it? Dozens of limbs now, some long, some thin, some jointed in ways that made no mechanical sense, spilling through the observatory doorway like roots, tearing free from ancient soil. They scuttled across the stone platform, clicking and adjusting to the uneven surface, every one of them turning toward me. But worse, far worse, was the shape rising behind them. Tall, narrow, its form shifting like pages being fanned quickly. A body made of overlapping pieces that caught the moonlight in sharp, uneven flashes. And at the top, where a face should have been, a flat plane, smooth as polished glass, reflecting my own shape back at me. It was learning, copying, imitating. Every click it made was another adjustment, another refinement, another step closer to understanding the thing it wanted to replace. My legs moved without permission, down the path. Faster, faster. The wind howled again, pushing against my back as though helping me run. The cliff twisted, revealing the narrow staircase carved into the rock that led to the base of the hill. If I could reach the tree line, if I could reach the road, if I could get far enough away. A sharp, splintering crack behind me shattered the thought. A limb slammed into the rock just above my head, scattering shards of stone. Another limb swept low across the path, forcing me to jump over it. The impact shook the cliff, sending gravel sliding under my boots. I stumbled, but didn't fall, didn't look back, didn't slow. The wind roared once more, guiding me downward in a single violent gust. And then, silence, instant and absolute, too abrupt, too perfect. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Nothing behind me, nothing on the path, nothing on the platform above. The observatory sat quiet under the moonlight, still and hollow, as though nothing had ever crawled out of it. Relief washed through me, too fast, too complete, because the silence wasn't absence, it was arrival. A soft click sounded directly beside my ear, then another, then a slow breath, not mine matching the shape of my own inhale perfectly. As if synchronizing, I turned, and the cliffside reflected my face back at me. Except the reflection blinked first. My reflection shouldn't have been there. There was no glass, no pool of water, no polished stone, just the uneven cliff wall, rough with lichen and old salt. Yet the face staring back at me was mine. My eyes, my breath, my tremble. But the movements were wrong, just slightly out of sync, like a puppet copying motions with a delay. I stepped back. The reflection leaned forward, not following, correcting. Click. The sound came from within the reflection's throat. A clean, precise adjustment, as though a joint had tightened. Then, another. Each click brought the mirrored face closer to matching me with unsettling perfection. I lifted my hand. The reflection didn't. It simply watched. Then it opened its mouth. No voice came out, only a slow exhale, like air being pushed through a narrow seam. The sound deepened, stretched, and folded into something that almost resembled a whisper. Not words, not language, a tone made from trying. The reflection tilted its head, testing the angle. Click, readjusting. Then my own voice came out of it quiet, breathy, but unmistakably mine. Look behind you. My stomach dropped. The cliff path behind me was silent, empty, impossibly still. But the wind, which had guided me all along, suddenly reversed, direction rushing past me and straight into the reflection, as if the air itself feared what stood behind my back. I didn't turn, couldn't. Something in the reflection's eyes. My eyes widened slightly, as though urging me, pleading almost. Another soft breath escaped it, A second attempt at speech. This time, the voice was clearer. "It sees you." My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I felt it echo in my teeth. The wind died. The night tightened around me. And then, right at the base of my neck, I felt it. A slow, deliberate exhale. Warm, patient, close enough that the ends of my hair lifted. The reflection didn't move, only smiled. A thin, unfolding smile, as if recognizing the moment it had been waiting to copy. I finally turned, and the cliffside went dark. Story 3. The house that records wind. The research house wasn't large, but it carried sound in a way that made it feel endless. Every wall was lined with narrow metal tubes, hundreds of them fixed at different angles to capture the shifting patterns of the night wind. My job was simple: check the instruments, make sure they hadn't clogged or frozen, and note any unusual resonance. But on my first night, the wind wasn't what I heard. I stepped inside and closed the door softly behind me. The tubes trembled with a gentle hum, each holding its own thin note, like 100 distant flutes breathing together. The sound should have been calming, predictable, mechanical. Instead, I froze halfway through the corridor. One of the tubes, just one, wasn't singing with the others. It wasn't catching wind. It was exhaling. A low, human breath, warm and deliberate, slid through the narrow metal pipe and brushed the side of my neck like the whisper of a stranger standing far too close. I turned slowly toward it. It breathed again. I stood there for several seconds, listening. The other tubes continued their gentle chorus then, airy notes rising and falling as the outside wind shifted. But the one before me stayed unnervingly consistent. No fluctuation, no wavering, just a slow, steady breath sliding out of it, warm enough to fog the cold metal. I stepped closer, drawn in by a mixture of caution and disbelief. The tube was identical to the other's slender, brushed steel, no wider than my thumb. Nothing inside it could produce warmth. Nothing inside it should produce breathing. I hovered my hand over the opening, not touching, just testing. Warm air met my palm, pulsing softly, like the exhale of someone trying not to be heard. A prickling unease crept across my skin. I scanned the walls around me. The house was long and narrow, with rows of tubes stretching into the dimness. Their voices blended into a hushed metallic harmony, quiet but constant, calm, predictable. Only this one tube disrupted the pattern. I checked the control panel nearby, though I knew it would tell me nothing. The dials flickered gently with the wind's movement. No sign of malfunction. No spike in temperature. Nothing to suggest an anomaly. Still, that breath continued. I leaned in until my ear hovered just above the opening, careful not to touch the rim. The breath grew clearer, deeper. A faint tremor threaded through it, as though whoever it belonged to was drawing in air from much farther away than the tube should allow. I pulled back sharply. Something wasn't right about the way it followed me. Even as I stepped away, the breath didn't dissipate, it lengthened, stretching after me like a thread of warm mist. I moved to another tube to compare. Cold air, pure wind, normal. Another one, cold, no voice, no heat. Back to the strange one, warm, so warm. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it down the tube, expecting, hoping to see nothing. The beam stretched into the metal throat, illuminating a smooth, empty passage. No dust, no obstruction, no source, just deeper metal. And then, faintly, the light trembled, as if something inside had shifted. Far down the line, too deep to see, I switched off the torch, the warmth of the breath brushing my fingertips again. The house groaned in the wind, a familiar bending of timber. But even that felt muted compared to this one wrong sound. I found myself backing away, step by cautious step, eyes fixed on the tube as though it were capable of motion. The air around it felt heavier, charged. The chorus of the other tubes dimmed in comparison, their thin notes now distant, fragile things. When my shoulder touched the opposite wall, I stopped. The tube continued breathing slow, steady, patient, almost as if it sensed it had my full attention. Then it inhaled, audibly, a long, dragging pool of air deep into its hollow body. As though drawing breath from the entire corridor, the other tubes fell silent. Every one of them. The house held its breath with the tube, and the moment that inhalation ended, the warm exhale returned, directed straight at me. The warm exhale didn't stop this time. It grew steadier, longer, gathering shape, as if something on the other end of the tube had drawn closer, much closer. The breath pushed against my skin in slow waves, too warm for the cold metal it traveled through. I felt it slide across my cheek like the hand of someone standing inches away. I pressed myself harder against the opposite wall, desperate for distance. The house creaked in reply, timber shifting, pipes trembling. Yet the rest of the tube stayed utterly silent. Their absence of sound made the single breathing tube feel unbearable, like the room was funneled into one narrow throat. Then, without warning, another tube woke. A faint whistle rose from across the corridor. Cold, a normal wind note, but it felt like a signal. Because a second later, a deeper hum vibrated from the far corner, soft at first, then fuller, swelling like a distant cello string. Then another tube joined, and another, not breathing, not human, but shifting pitch by pitch, tone by tone, aligning themselves until the entire wall began to murmur in a low, rising harmony. The air quivered against my chest. Dust leapt from the floorboards. Even my hair lifted in the vibration. Yet through it all, the warm breath from the first tube persisted, steady, unwavering, cutting through the growing chorus like a single whispered command. The house wasn't reacting to the wind. It was reacting to me. I edged sideways along the wall, careful not to break eye contact with the breathing tube. The hum thickened, filling the corridor with a sound that vibrated inside my jaw. Pipes trembled like tuning forks struck simultaneously. The metal sang through the timber, notes blending into something almost melodic, almost purposeful. As I moved, the breathing tube followed me, not physically, but audibly. The breath shifted in angle and force, tracking the direction of my movement. When I stopped, it steadied. When I took another step, it inhaled sharply, as though startled. The chorus behind me grew harsher, no longer humming, grinding. Tubes rattled violently, each one shaking in its mount with such force the screws began to whine. The pitch rose, sharp and metallic, threading through my ears until it felt like noise was pressing directly into my skull. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't matter. The sound wasn't outside anymore. It was in the house, in the walls, in the floorboards, in me. The lights flickered once, then steadied. The breath from the tube deepened, thick with heat, like something leaning its mouth right against the opening. Something close enough to smell me. I stumbled backwards, and my heels struck a fallen piece of debris. The small clatter echoed unnaturally loud, and the entire house responded. Every tube inhaled at once. A horrifying, cavernous draw of air, cold, metallic, endless. Then, silence. Total, immediate, artificial. Even the wind outside died, as if cut off by an unseen hand. I stood trembling, waiting for what came next. It came softly, from right beside my ear. A whisper made only of breath, not words, not voice. Just intent slipped through the first tube with slow, deliberate purpose. The entire corridor seemed to lean in. Then the second tube breathed, warm, human-like. Then a third, then a fourth. In perfect sequence. Exhale, 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 exhale. Each one closer to human, closer to mine. The tones shifted subtle, careful, imitating the exact rhythm of my breathing, matching the length of each exhale, the slight catch in my throat, the subtle tremble of fear. The house wasn't just recording wind, it was learning me. I felt the urge to run, the primal, animal instinct to escape a predator I couldn't yet see. But the moment the thought flickered through me, the first tube responded with a long, slow inhale, deeper than any before, and the entire wall exhaled back at me. A single, unified breath, warm, human, surrounding. The sound of something with 100 mouths, finally ready to speak. The unified exhale rolled over me like a wave of heat, pushing against my chest until I felt my ribs tighten. It wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of the corridor, an intimate, invasive breath that felt as though the walls themselves were leaning in to smell me. My own breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I stood suspended in the house's inhalation, waiting for whatever came next. The first tube spoke. Not a word, just a sound shaped like one. A wet, tentative attempt at forming the curve of a syllable. My blood froze. A second tube picked up the attempt. Not quite human, not quite wind, something in between. The third tube exhaled sharply, correcting the tone, matching the rhythm of my own panicked breathing. The rest of the tubes murmured in response, adjusting their pitches in cascading waves. The whole wall shivered, metal trembling against wood. The house wasn't trying to copy speech. It was trying to copy me. I forced myself backward, step by cautious step. The unified exhalation followed, adjusting its warmth and speed each time I moved, as though it were trying to keep its breath aligned with mine. The breath tracking wasn't random. It was deliberate, focused. I reached the junction where the narrow corridor split into two wings. One path led deeper into the house toward the central chamber where the main wind instruments were installed. The other led to the back exit, a short walkway that opened toward the forest. Escape. I chose the right path. The tube sensed it instantly. A deep, collective inhale dragged through the walls, a sucking of air so powerful it made the wooden boards creak inward, bowing toward the tubes as if caught in a sudden vacuum. Dust spiraled upward. My hair whipped forward, and then The doorway to the exit slammed shut. Not with force. Not violently. Just a soft, firm click, as though a hand had pushed it closed. My heart thudded painfully. I grabbed the handle and yanked. Locked. Impossible. There was no lock on this door. No latch. Just a simple push bar on the outside. The house hummed with quiet satisfaction. I turned slowly. The tubes closest to me had angled themselves just slightly. Barely perceptible, but enough that their openings pointed in my direction like narrow, metallic pupils. A breath slipped from the nearest one. Warm, moist, deliberate. It wasn't mimicking my breathing anymore. It was testing distance. Something in the wall behind that tube shifted with a low, dragging scrape. The metal clamps holding the tube trembled. Screws twisted half a turn. I realized too late that the tubes weren't just conducting breath. They were connected to something deeper inside the walls. Something that could move. A sudden, sharp whistle pierced the corridor. Not from a tube. This came from the central chamber. A high, thin shriek of air being forced through a narrow crack. It echoed through the house like an alarm. The tubes responded immediately. A chorus of inhales. Long, deep, coordinated. The air pressure in the corridor changed so quickly I felt my ears pop. The breath from the tubes was no longer warm, it was hot, like air forced through a furnace. A burning draft seared across my face, pushing me back from the exit door. I stumbled into the opposite hallway, the one leading to the central chamber. The tubes on both sides shuddered violently, adjusting their angles with rapid clicks, like 1,000 finger joints cracking in unison. Some rotated to follow me. Others turned their openings toward each other, forming channels of airflow. The house was preparing for something. I ran. The corridor stretched ahead of me, narrowing as the sound swelled. The hum transformed into a roar wind forced through metal at impossible speed. The tubes around me blurred, vibrating so fiercely they became streaks of shifting steel. Hot air lashed my skin. The floor thudded beneath each step. The wooden beams groaned under the pressure. I reached the central chamber and slammed the door behind me. The roar muted instantly, muffled by the thick insulation. For the first time in minutes, silence wrapped around me. My breath trembled. Sweat slid slowly down my neck. Then I noticed something. The central chamber, the heart of the house, contained no windows, no exits besides the door I'd just closed. But it held something worse. A single, enormous tube rising from floor to ceiling, far wider than the others. A main recorder, designed to capture whole gusts of wind. I swallowed hard, because the giant tube was breathing, not outward, inward, drawing long, deep breaths, as though preparing its lungs. A faint warmth radiated from its opening, and then, deep inside the metal throat, something shifted. Not wind, not machinery. Something with weight. Something waking. For a long moment, I didn't move. The central chamber was still unnervingly still, except for the faint, rhythmic draw of air slipping into the giant tube. Even that sound had softened, turning almost gentle, like the slow breathing of someone finally drifting into sleep. I inched backward until my shoulders touched the door I had just closed. My palms pressed against its cold surface, half expecting it to pulse with heat from the tubes outside. But it didn't. It remained cool, solid, normal. The silence returned with a strange warmth, a fragile peace settling across the room. The panic in my chest eased by degrees. My breathing, shaky and uneven, slowly fell into its usual rhythm. The monstrous hum from the corridor felt impossibly distant now, like something I had imagined in a moment of exhaustion. I told myself that I needed to. The giant tube's inhale softened further, becoming almost indistinguishable from the natural sound of air passing through metal. Perhaps the entire system had overloaded, some pressure surge or resonance collapse, creating illusions of breath and movement. It was a house built to manipulate wind. After all, the line between natural sound and hallucination could blur easily in a place like this. Or so I tried to believe. I approached the main tube cautiously, stopping a few feet away. The metal casing gleamed faintly under the low light. No heat shimmered across its surface. No breath touched my skin. It looked like a simple, oversized wind instrument, nothing more. A thin layer of dust covered its base. Nothing had disturbed it. A small relief pooled in my chest. I crouched and placed my hand near the opening, not touching, just feeling for warmth. Nothing. Only the faintest current of cool air brushing my fingers. Cool. Not warm. Not human. I exhaled slowly, tension loosening from the back of my neck. The silence inside this room felt real, anchored. The chaos in the corridor seemed impossibly distant now, unbelievable even. The house had been reacting to the wind. That was all. A trick of acoustics, a trick of fear. I straightened up, rolling the tension from my shoulders. I just need to leave, I murmured, barely above a whisper. The chamber didn't react. No echo, no breath. Good. I turned to the door and rested my hand on the handle. Cool. Unmoving. I pushed. It gave way easily, far easier than I expected, opening on a corridor that was no longer shrieking, no longer trembling. The tubes on either side stood quiet and still, aligned perfectly in their mounts. No heat radiated from them. No inhales. No warm exhalations. Just silence. It felt like stepping out of a nightmare into a room I had always known. I took one step forward, then another. My heart steadied. My breath softened. Everything was fine. I began to walk toward the front door of the house, the one that led back to the outside aerial air, unpredictable and comforting. I rehearsed the report I would give, a malfunction, perhaps resonance anomalies. Maybe the house needed recalibration. Nothing supernatural, nothing alive. I passed the first junction, then the second. I dared to let a small smile pull at my mouth. But as I approached the third junction, the one closest to the exit, I noticed something curious. Every tube on the left wall was angled perfectly straight. Every tube on the right wall was angled perfectly straight. Except one. The first tube I had heard breathing. It pointed directly at me. Its metal casing didn't tremble. Its screws were tight. It had not moved. And yet its alignment was unmistakable. Not random. Not accidental. As though it had never shifted at all. And everything else had shifted back around it. A chill crawled up my spine. Still, I forced myself closer. Slowly, calmly, I raised my hand toward the tube, not touching it, just wanting to confirm that it was cold again. My fingers hovered an inch from the opening. Nothing. No warmth. No breath. Relief trickled in again, softer this time, tinged with embarrassment. I almost laughed at myself, at the absurdity of the fear that had taken hold of me. I exhaled, and the tube exhaled back. A warm, long breath. as though it had been waiting for mine. The warmth spread across my hand, slow and deliberate, brushing the inside of my wrist like fingertips. Behind me, from the central chamber, came a faint metallic sound, a tiny click, then another, then another. The giant tube had begun to breathe again. The warmth from the tube lingered on my wrist like an unwelcome hand. Not forceful, not violent, just present, as though something on the other side of that narrow metal throat had leaned forward to greet me. I stepped back instinctively, and the tube inhaled, not sharply, slowly, deeply, as if drawing in the air I had just exhaled. The sound traveled down its length with a soft, wet tremor, like breath sliding across the inside of a living throat. Then, from the central chamber behind me, click, 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 the giant tube's breathing returned with terrible clarity. I turned toward the chamber just in time to feel a wave of warm air push down the corridor. It rolled under my coat, lifting the fabric, brushing the back of my neck like a warning whispered too late. The house wasn't waking up. It had already been awake, and now it was coordinating. I ran. My boots hammered against the wooden boards, each footfall swallowed almost instantly by the rising breath filling the corridor behind me. The tubes responded in a chain, first one, then a cluster, then entire rows, each inhaling sharply as I passed them, like hundreds of mouths snapping open to catch the echo of my movement. The breath chased me, not wind, not resonance, something alive. I reached the next junction at full speed, then stopped dead. The exit door was gone. Not closed, not blocked, gone. Only a blank expanse of wall stood where it had been, smooth, seamless, as though the wood had grown over the doorway. My breath hitched. I reached out, running trembling fingers across the surface. No seam, no hinge, not even a groove. The house was changing around me. I spun back toward the corridor and froze again. The tubes were turning, not shuddering or trembling, rotating one by one, slow, deliberate motions that aligned their narrow mouths toward me. The sound that rose from them wasn't wind at all. It was a soft murmur, the blending of countless breaths forming a single, unified voice, not yet shaped into words. I backed away. The tubes followed. Their breath grew warmer. The house was breathing me in. A sudden vibration shook the boards beneath my feet. Dust cascaded from the rafters. The wooden walls groaned. The entire corridor shifted slightly to the left, as though the building were adjusting its posture, trying to draw me deeper into its body. No, 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 I whispered, stumbling backward. The corridor stretched as I moved. I could feel it subtle at first, then undeniable. The house wasn't letting me leave. It wanted me to go where it needed me, and I was out of choices. The warm breath surged forward again, pushing at my back, nudging me toward the central chamber. I braced myself against the wall, but the pressure grew stronger, pulsing in slow, rhythmic waves. The tubes inhaled in unison. My ears popped, the air thinned. I gasped, and the tubes all exhaled together, matching the pitch and depth of my breath with horrifying accuracy. Then the corridor tilted. Not much, but enough. Enough to make me lose balance. I fell backward through the doorway straight into the central chamber. The door slammed behind me. Darkness swallowed the room for a moment before the emergency lights flickered on, casting a pale amber glow over the giant tube at the center. It was moving, not shifting with pressure, not reacting mechanically, moving. The wide opening flared slightly, like nostrils dilating. The metal surface expanded and contracted in slow, rhythmic pulses breathing with deep, deliberate intent. The air around it vibrated. The warmth increased. The hum deepened into a low, resonant growl. I backed into the wall, heart pounding so hard it drowned everything else out. But the house listened. It absorbed every vibration, every sound, every breath, and it repeated them. The giant tube inhaled sharply, and the smaller tubes throughout the structure answered, carrying the breath toward this room in a building-wide cascade of exhalations. The chamber trembled. I covered my ears. It didn't matter. The sound was inside me now, in my chest, in my teeth, in my bones, a resonance that felt like it was tuning me. The giant tube leaned forward, not a trick of perspective, not the house shifting. It leaned, a long, slow arc toward me. Its mouth opened wider. Heat poured out. The breath that touched my face was unmistakably human. The temperature, the moisture, the subtle tremble of a living chest, except no person was behind it. Only darkness. I pressed myself into the wall, desperate for breath, desperate for something not being copied back at me. My chest tightened as the giant tube inhaled again, and with terrible clarity, I heard my own breath echoing inside it. Not similar, not close, exact, perfectly matched, as though the house had learned me so completely it could now breathe with me. I bolted along the edge of the chamber, searching for anything, an access hatch, an inspection panel, a window, a latch. My hands found nothing, just seamless wood. I turned back toward the tube, and every smaller tube in the walls opened with a soft, simultaneous pop. The air they expelled warm, wet, human pushed me forward, driving me toward the center. The giant tube inhaled in anticipation, widening its mouth, bending lower. A single thought cut through the panic. It's not recording wind anymore. It's recording me, and it wants a final sample. I sprinted, straight toward the ladder leading to the maintenance gantry overhead. My boots clanged against the rungs, and for a moment I felt the house hesitate, surprised, perhaps, that I wasn't freezing like prey cornered. But the hesitation didn't last. The tubes roared. Warm air blasted up the ladder behind me, almost knocking me off. I climbed faster, fingers slipping on the cold metal, lungs burning. I reached the gantry, rolled over the edge, ran. Below me, the giant tube surged upward, rising toward the gantry like a living column. Its mouth opened wide, snapping at the air beneath me with a hungry, rhythmic inhale. I reached the emergency hatch at the far end. Jam-resistant, manual release. My hands fumbled for the latch. I found it, yanked. The hatch blew open. Cold night air slammed into me. The house wailed a long, furious blast of shifting tubes. I didn't look back. I hurled myself through the hatch into the darkness outside. My shoulder hit the ground first, then my ribs, then my knees. I rolled down a slope of wet grass, tumbling hard until the house vanished behind the ridge. The night air burned in my lungs, wild and alive and real. And behind me, somewhere inside the house, I heard the tubes mimic my ragged breathing, perfectly, matching the rhythm of my escape. Like Something had learned my breath and wasn't willing to forget it. I lay on the wet grass for several seconds, chest heaving, lungs burning with cold air that finally belonged to the world outside. No warmth, no imitation, no presence leaning in to match me. Just the wind raw, uneven, imperfect, alive. I pushed myself upright slowly, every muscle trembling. The house sat atop the ridge like a silhouette carved from the night. Quiet now. Still. No lights. No movement. No shifting tubes. For a moment, it looked almost harmless. Almost. A thin mist drifted across the field, curling around my legs as I stood. I listened carefully for any trace of breath that was not my own. Nothing came. Not a whisper. Not a hum. Relief, fragile but real, loosened my shoulders. I took a cautious step backward, and the grass behind me exhaled. Not wind, not the natural sigh of the land. A soft, warm breath, human in shape, deliberate in intention. I spun around. Nothing. Just the field. Silent and empty. But the breath had been real. I felt it on the back of my neck like the faintest brush of fingertips. My pulse quickened. I backed away again, keeping my eyes fixed on the dark grass. The mist drifted harmlessly. The wind stirred faintly. All ordinary. Then, far above, at the ridge, the house shifted. Not the structure, not the walls, the tubes. One by one, they angled outward, not pointing at the sky, not at the trees, pointing at me. Their openings glinted in the moonlight, hundreds of narrow circular mouths, all perfectly aligned. I couldn't hear anything yet, but the silence felt charged, swollen with intent. I took another step, and the first two breathed. A soft, warm exhale drifted down the ridge, then another, then 10, then all of them breathing in a slow, unified rhythm that rolled over the grass like the tide, breathing outward, breathing toward me, breathing my rhythm. My stomach dropped. The house hadn't been trying to keep me inside. That was never the goal. It had been studying me, tuning itself to me, learning the exact measure of my breath. And now that I had left, it was calling me back. A final exhale brushed across my cheek, gentle as a whisper. Come home. I ran, and behind me, the wind learned my name, Story 4. The counting river, the river beside the research station, moved strangely at night. It wasn't fast, nor violent, just slow. Too slow, as though time passed differently beneath its black surface. I first noticed it during a routine evening measurement. The air was calm, the sky absorbed into a single sheet of cloud, and the only sound should have been the quiet trickle of water against the embankment. But the river wasn't trickling. It was counting. I stood on the narrow wooden platform with my equipment bag still slung over one shoulder, listening to the faintest whisper rising from below. Not voices, not wind, just a soft, rhythmic murmur like someone speaking numbers underwater, each syllable elongated by the current. 1. Long pause. 2. The ripples on the surface spread outward in perfect circles, each one forming with the next whispered number. I leaned closer, breath held tight in my throat. 3. The voice didn't come from along the river. It came from directly beneath where I stood, and it was counting up. I stayed on the platform longer than I should have, leaning over the black water with my hands gripping the rail. The river moved sluggishly beneath me, thick as oil, its surface barely disturbed except for the slow widening circles that followed each whispered number. The counting wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It pressed itself into the silence with a strange confidence, as if it knew the night would carry its voice straight to me. 4. This time, the number lingered, stretching thin like it traveled a long distance before breaking the surface. I straightened suddenly, forcing myself to breathe. Rivers don't count. Water doesn't speak. I told myself that, but the sound threaded through the mist anyway, carrying a faint, human rasp. It reminded me of someone speaking through cupped hands, muffled, breath heavy, as if the river were trying to hide the effort it took to form each number. I stepped away from the edge, boots thudding softly against the wooden planks. The research station loomed behind me, a squat concrete building, dark windows reflecting the dull sheen of the water. Its silhouette should have made me feel safe, but every part of me felt watched. 5. The word rose just as my hand touched the door. A little louder, a little clearer. I waited, listening to the stillness. Then the river moved, not the surface, something beneath it. A long, slow shift, like a body adjusting its weight under a blanket. The water bulged, ever so slightly, just enough for moonlight to fracture along its surface. A cold sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I backed toward the building, refusing to take my eyes off the river. A bubble broke the surface. Then another, small, controlled, too evenly spaced to be random. I knelt to look closer. The bubbles were rising from a single point directly under the platform, floating upward in a thin vertical line. The counting resumed between them, whispered with an odd softness. 6. The current brushed the wooden beams beneath me, its rhythm shifting, synchronizing, almost with the pulse of the whispered numbers. That was the part that unnerved me more than anything. The water wasn't just moving, it was responding. I stepped back again, this time into the cold concrete wall of the station. The air felt heavier than before, thick with moisture and something else, a faint vibration, subtle enough to feel only when I held my breath. The river wasn't just counting upward, it was approaching. I turned to open the station door, but stopped halfway when I heard another sound so faint I might have imagined it. A soft tapping beneath the platform. 2 taps. Pause. 2 more. As if something under the water were testing the underside of the wood. Then the counting whispered again, closer. Impossibly close. 7. The number broke slightly, catching on, something like lips brushing the surface of the water before slipping back under. That was when I realized the platform wasn't vibrating. It was breathing. The platform's breathing was slow at first, so slow I almost mistook it for the shifting of old timber against the cold night air. But as I pressed my palm to the planks, the rhythm became undeniable, a faint expansion, then a subtle release, a pulse, a chest. I stood completely still, feeling the vibration move beneath my hand like the echo of a heartbeat deep underwater. The river whispered again. 8. This time the number rose with a wet resonance, like it traveled through layers of water before reaching air. The circles on the surface widened. The boards creaked softly under my boots, not from weight, but from pressure rising beneath them. I backed away slowly, afraid even to exhale too loudly. The river responded to movement. I tested the theory, lifting my foot just slightly, and the water stirred. A thin ripple broke from directly beneath me, spreading outward in a perfect ring. It wasn't propelled by current. It was propelled by attention. 9. Louder. Clearer. Closer. I retreated to the station wall again, trying to steady my breath. The railing on the platform began to tremble, rattling softly as if small hands were trailing along its underside. The mist along the river thickened, rising in a slow column that mimicked the widening circles. For the first time, I noticed the current had stopped entirely. The river lay still, utterly still, except for the concentric ripples matching the count. A sound like shifting gravel rose from beneath the water, low and grinding. It traveled along the riverbed, following the line of the platform, and the boards above it vibrated in response, dust falling from the joints. Something was moving underneath, something deliberate. I swallowed hard. A voice then as thread rose through the water. 10. The whisper fractured at the edges, breaking apart like air being forced through a narrow space. The number echoed across the riverbank, bouncing off the station walls and dissolving into the heavy mist. Then another sound emerged. A new one. Knocking, soft at first. 3 light taps beneath the planks, directly below my feet. I froze. The taps repeated, this time in a rhythmic pattern. Knock, 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 knock. A sequence, a signal. My breath quickened despite my attempts to stay calm. The river reacted instantly. Its whispered, counting, warping into an urgent, watery hiss. The next number strained upward. 11. The sound trembled as if the voice was rising through a narrowing throat. I stepped sideways, unable to stop myself, and immediately the water responded, forming a ripple that followed my exact movement, the way a shadow mirrors the tilt of a body. Another knock, harder. Something directly beneath the platform pressed upward. A bulge lifted one of the boards by a few millimeters before settling again. I staggered back, heart racing. The river's counting voice changed. No longer a single whisper, but a layered chorus, several tones overlapping, drifting upward like many mouths trying to speak through the same water. 12. A cold wind blew across the bank then, harsh and sudden, spiraling the mist in tight circles. But the mist didn't disperse, it rose, coalescing around the base of the platform. And then I heard it, a faint, wet dragging sound, something sliding along the underside of the wooden planks. The voice rose sharply. 13. My pulse throbbed in my throat. I wanted to flee into the station, lock the door, shut out the sight and sound of the river altogether. But the dragging stopped the moment I moved, and the platform shuddered with a deep, displeased groan. It didn't want me to leave. I turned back slowly, forcing myself to look. The river was rising. Not surging, not flooding, just lifting by degrees, as though something below was pushing the entire surface upward. Bubbles formed in a neat vertical line beneath the platform, each one breaking with a soft pop like tiny mouths opening. The counting increased in pace. 14, 15. The platform boards bowed upward, straining against nails. Then the knocking turned into something else. A clear, sharp tapping that traveled along the underside of the wood in a perfect circle, following the edge, tracing the shape, as if outlining where to break through. 16. My breath hitched, and from below the water, impossibly loud, the voice whispered directly beneath my feet. Step closer. I didn't step closer. Every instinct told me not to. But the river waited as though it expected obedience, its surface tight. It stretched, barely trembling. The counting voice fell silent for the first time since it began. A stillness spread through the air, thick as breath held too long. Then the platform exhaled. A soft, warm gust rose from the gaps between the planks, brushing my ankles like something below had sighed upward. It wasn't river cold. It wasn't night cold. It was body warm, as though the water had lungs. I staggered backward until my shoulders hit the concrete wall of the station. The voice emerged again, no longer counting. Just one word. Closer. The word vibrated through the boards, not spoken aloud, but produced by movement like a chest scraping against timber from below. The surface of the river pulsed, rising slightly, as though straining to reach my shadow. My breath fogged in the cold air, drifting toward the water. The river seemed to watch it, then mimic it. A faint mist rose from its surface, copying the shape of my exhale, drifting in the same slow curl. The river wasn't just counting, it was mirroring. A sudden knock hammered the underside of the platform hard enough to jolt the wood. I gasped and instinctively stepped sideways. The knocking followed immediately, tracing my movement with uncanny precision. Tapping beneath each plank, my foot passed over. Tap, tap, tap. A perfect echo of my steps. The river whispered. 17. The number slithered up through the water with a gurgling tremor, as though passing between submerged teeth. The syllables elongated, trembling with effort, as if something enormous was forcing sound upward through water, not meant to hold a voice. I slid along the wall toward the station door. My fingers found the handle. Cold metal, real, solid, safe. But when I pulled, it didn't move. I yanked harder. Nothing. The door wasn't locked. It was held. A knock. This one directly beneath me, jolted up the wall and into my spine. The river whispered a little louder. Aid team. The dragging resumed underneath the platform, circling in tight loops, faster and faster, like claws tracing the outline of a coffin lid. The boards above strained upward, bending under pressure from below. A crack split the wood near the edge, thin but deliberate. I stepped away from the wall. Immediately, the ripples followed. Immediately, the voice responded. 19. The water near the platform edge bulged upward, forming a rounded swell that didn't break, as though something beneath pressed the surface with the crown of its head. Then another swell, and another. 3 points rising, 3 shapes pushing upward. The counting voice grew thick, layered, as if more mouths had joined in beneath the river. Then, without warning, the boards at the platform's center buckled upward by a full inch. A sudden, violent jolt that sent a tremor through my legs. The planks snapped back down. The river moaned, displeased. A long, deep scrape dragged under me, something heavy shifting its weight. And then, softly, from directly beneath the platform, 20. The number was clear. Close. Breathing. The surface broke. Not with a splash, with a push. A pale shape rose through the water, just for a moment, just high enough for moonlight to slide across its surface. Not a hand, not a face, something smooth, rounded, too uniform to be human. I leaned in without meaning to, horror overriding caution. The shape dipped back under. The water stilled. Then, from beneath the surface, the voice rose again, stronger, no longer muffled, 21. The counting wasn't random. It wasn't following numbers. It wasn't marking time. It was marking distance, measuring how close I was. A loud crack ripped through the platform. A plank split right down the middle, driven upward by something striking it from below. I stumbled backward, tripped over a tool crate, hit the ground hard. Pain shot up my elbow. The river hissed. 22. Another strike. This one so hard the entire platform jumped. The counting quickened, vibrating through the air like a warning bell. 23, 24. The bursts of sound overlapped, rushing upward, the water trembling with every number. Something was rising, fast. I scrambled to my feet. The river boomed one final number, bursting from the water like a shockwave. 25. The platform exploded upward as something massive slammed against it from below. I ran, and behind me, the river whispered with a hunger I felt in my bones. Closer. I didn't stop running until my legs gave out beneath me. The grass was wet, cold, and uneven, but it felt merciful compared to the vibrating wood of the platform. I collapsed onto my hands, gulping air into lungs that felt too small to keep me alive. The river's counting had stopped the moment I'd left the platform, but the echo of the numbers still clung to my ears like a memory that refused to release its grip. For several long seconds, there was nothing but the sound of my breathing and the distant lap of water against the embankment. No counting, no tapping, no voice rising through the dark. Just the natural night icy, quiet, indifferent. Relief slid through me in slow waves. I pushed myself upright and looked back toward the river. The platform stood crooked, splintered along one edge where something had struck it from below. But the surface of the river had returned to calm, perfectly calm. No ripples, no bulges pushing upward, no unnatural circles breaking its skin. Just still, black water. I backed farther up the slope, putting more distance between myself and the river before finally stopping beneath a cluster of birch trees. Their pale trunks caught the moonlight, casting thin shadows across the grass. I let my spine press against the nearest one, grounding myself in its solidity. The night remained silent. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever rose beneath that platform had only been reacting to sound. Weight, vibration. Perhaps it mistook me for something else. Perhaps my panic made me hear patterns in water that were never there. I clung to the possibility. My breath slowed from frantic gasps to ragged exhales. The cold air steadied me. My heart softened in its pounding. My hands stopped trembling. Everything around me looked normal again. Normal enough to doubt everything I had seen. The platform's damage could be explained. Weakened boards, old structure, frost expanding in the wood, the counting, the warmth, the breathing. My mind scrambled to rewrite reality into something survivable. Even the silence felt different now, not the heavy, waiting stillness from before, but the genuine quiet of a remote research station at night. A quiet I had always known. I stayed there until the tension in my jaw loosened, until the cold found its way into my ankles, until the birch bark dug softly into my spine. Just when I began to believe I might walk back to the station, gather my things, and lock myself inside, something small and round tapped against my boot. I jumped, but when I looked down, it was only a river pebble, a pale oval stone wet with dew. It must have rolled downhill. I whispered to myself, forcing the explanation to fit. I nudged it away with my foot. It rolled back, not downhill, toward me. I froze, breath locked in my throat. The pebble rested against the toe of my boot, perfectly still, too still. The birch leaves around me rustled with a passing breeze, but the pebble didn't budge, not even a tremble, as if the earth beneath it had changed tilt to keep it exactly where it wanted to be. I crouched slowly, extending a cautious hand toward it. Before my fingers touched the stone, a faint vibration shivered up through the soil beneath my feet. Soft, steady, rhythmic, a familiar rhythm. No, I told myself. It couldn't be. I pressed my palm flat to the ground. The earth pulsed beneath it, expanding, contracting. With the unmistakable cadence of breathing, I staggered back violently, scrambling away on hands and knees as the ground throbbed again, this time harder, shaking loose a scatter of pebbles. They rolled toward the river in a series of tiny clicks. I forced myself to my feet. The river remained perfectly still, but beneath the ground, the pulse strengthened, and then, between the pulses, a whisper rose. Not from the river, not from the platform, from the soil itself. 26. Barely audible, barely formed, as though spoken through packed earth and buried water. I clapped a hand over my mouth. The whisper came again, clearer. 26. My knees weakened, because the counting hadn't stopped. It hadn't stalled when I fled the platform. It had continued moving toward me. I stepped back. The earth vibrated once more. 27. And the river, still and black and silent behind me, remained exactly that. Silent. Not because it was finished, but because it was listening. The next pulse beneath the soil struck with enough force to make the birch trunks shiver. Not wind, not footsteps. A rising pressure, steady, deliberate, like something vast was pushing upward from below, using the very earth as a lung. 28. The ground whispered again, and I felt the number vibrate through the soles of my boots. Not through air, through dirt, through stone, through groundwater. The counting had moved beneath me. I staggered backward until my spine hit another tree. The bark scraped my shoulders, grounding me for a moment, just long enough to swallow the panic rising in my throat. A brittle twig snapped nearby. I spun toward the sound. Nothing. Just darkness and the quiet rustle of birch leaves. But the vibration beneath my feet strengthened, radiating outward in a widening circle. Pebbles jittered on the soil. Grass flattened in small patches as if pressed by unseen fingertips. 29. The whisper was louder now, less muffled, as though whatever voice lived beneath the earth had moved closer to the surface. I forced my breathing to stay quiet, shallow, but the ground pulsed in reply, matching me beat for beat. It was still tracking my distance, still counting upward. I couldn't stay here. I turned toward the research station, the concrete shape barely visible through a veil of mist. There was light inside, only a dim emergency glow, but enough to suggest civilization. Shelter, walls. I ran. The whispers followed immediately. Third tee, third tie one, counting faster, closing the gap. The earth surged upward beneath each step, softening just enough to make my footing unsteady, as if the ground itself wanted to slow me down. I stumbled once, twice, but pushed forward, the station door growing closer with every desperate stride. When I reached it, My hand shook so badly, I fumbled the keycard twice before the reader finally blinked green. The lock clicked open. I slipped inside and slammed the door shut. Chest heaving. Silence. Blessed, solid silence. For a moment. Then, something struck the ground outside. Not a tap, a thud, heavy enough to rattle the doorframe. I backed away, staring as dust drifted from the hinges. 32. The number seeped through the concrete. Clearer now, more confident, as though the walls offered no resistance at all. I bolted toward the interior hall, slapping on every light switch I passed. White fluorescence flickered to life, revealing steel counters, data terminals, shelves stacked with survey gear. Familiar, rational things, tools, equipment. My world. I needed to think. A tremor rolled through the building, lifting the floor under my feet by a fraction of an inch before dropping it again. The lights flickered. A cobalt mug fell from a table and shattered. 33. The voice didn't drift in from the door this time. It rose straight through the floor. I sprinted to the monitoring room. Its heavy door was reinforced, built for storm conditions. I locked it behind me and shoved a metal cabinet against it. My breath frosted the air in front of me. The room was colder than it should have been. I checked the monitors. The river appeared calm on the screen, smooth, dark, featureless. That was somehow worse. The platform was cracked but intact. Then the soil beneath the platform shifted. I saw it on camera. A bulge, a ripple, like something enormous turning under a blanket. 34. I slapped the power switch off. No more images. I couldn't watch that. The floor vibrated again, harder this time. Tools rattled in their drawers. The overhead lights buzzed angrily, dimming to a sickly yellow. I pressed myself against the back wall. A low, wet sound rose beneath me. The sound of water being forced through soil. Upward. The counting followed. 35. Now spoken with a trembling enthusiasm, as though the inches between us were closing quickly. The temperature dropped sharply. My breath turned into a visible cloud. The tiles beneath my boots grew cold, then colder, then warm. Not hot. Warm, as though the earth below had exhaled. 36. I scrambled onto the nearest table, pulling my feet away just as the center tile cracked with a soft snap. A thin line spread outward like a spider web. Water seeped upward, not flooding, just rising in thin beads that collected into a shimmering pool. Then the pool rippled. I froze. A finger broke the surface. Pale, slender, with skin stretched too tightly over bone. It touched the underside of the cracked tile, pressing with slow intent, as though testing its own strength. I clamped a hand over my mouth. The finger withdrew. The ripples calmed. For a moment, then a second finger appeared. Then a third. A hand pushed upward, palm open, straining against the floor. The voice rose directly beneath me. 37. The tile splintered. I leapt from the table, crashing shoulder first through the emergency exit door that led to the maintenance stairwell. Pain shot down my arm, but adrenaline swallowed it whole. I tumbled onto the steps and rolled halfway down before catching myself. Behind me, the floor of the monitoring room buckled upward with a sickening crack. I ran, down the stairs, through the lower corridor, toward the back exit. Every step shook as the earth moved with me, hunting my position. 38, 39, 44. The back door burst open under my weight. Cold air swallowed me whole. I sprinted into the night, grass whipping against my shins, the station shrinking behind me. The ground pulsed violently, now bigger surges, as though something enormous was nearly breaking the surface. 41. It roared the number this time. No whisper. No subtlety. The voice gaining volume with terrifying speed. I didn't look back. Not until the river came into view ahead. And just as I reached the bank, the earth behind me convulsed. A massive bulge rose from the soil, lifting grass and stones and roots with it. A shape swelled beneath the ground, stretching, shifting, moving toward me with horrifying momentum. The counting blasted through the earth. 42. I dove forward, and the ground behind me erupted. A geyser of black water, a scream of rushing earth. I scrambled onto the nearest embankment just as something enormous surged beneath the river's surface, sending waves crashing against both banks. The counting voice gurgled upward, warped now, deeper, closer. 43. I didn't wait for 44. I ran into the woods, leaving the river, the station, and the rising earth behind me. And the night carried that hungry, rising number long after I could no longer see the water. Story 5. The Sleepless Orchard. The orchard was never meant to be tended at night. The researchers told me the sensors didn't need supervision after dusk, that the fruit fell too rarely to justify overnight shifts. But I took the job anyway, extra pay, quiet surroundings, and rows of apple trees that swayed softly whenever the wind passed through them. But on my first night, there was no wind. The orchard stood perfectly still, branches frozen in the cold air. Even the leaves seemed to hold their breath. The only sound was my own footsteps on the frost-brittle soil, until something rolled. A soft thump, thup, thup behind me. I turned. An apple lay in the center of the path, perfectly round, perfectly red, though none had been there moments before. It trembled once, as if settling. Then it rolled toward me. Slowly, deliberately. As it neared my boot, a faint sound leaked from its skin, a whispering rasp, tired and breathless. My own voice. I need sleep. The apple stopped at my feet and exhaled. I stared at the apple for a long moment, waiting for some trick of the light, some breath of wind, some rational correction to snap reality back into its proper shape. But the orchard stayed motionless, every branch stiff as sculpture. The only thing that moved was the thin mist drifting around my ankles. The apple lay still, its skin glowing faintly under my torch. Too red, too polished, too awake. I crouched slowly, careful not to touch it. The ground beneath me was cold, but a faint warmth radiated from the apple's surface, as though it held a fever beneath its skin. A thin line of condensation formed on the frost around it, the tiny halo of melted earth. The whisper repeated. Not loud, not clear, just exhausted. I need sleep. My breath hitched. The voice was undeniably mind-strained, worn thin, as though spoken after days without rest. I swallowed and swept my torch across the rows of trees. Nothing moved. The orchard stretched into darkness, row after row of bare branches and fruit-littered ground. Yet something in the arrangement felt wrong, subtle shifts in the spacing between trunks. as if the rows weren't quite aligned the way they had been earlier in the evening. A soft tick echoed from deeper in the orchard, followed by another. Not apples falling, not branches cracking. A rhythmic, dragging sound like something rolling gently along the soil. I straightened, gripping my torch, and took a step backward, only for my heel to land on something round. I jerked away instinctively, spinning around. Another apple, behind me, perfectly still, yet not where it should have been. Its skin was pale, not red, but its surface trembled slightly, as though something shuffled inside it. I nudged it gently with my boot. It rolled toward me and whispered, "Don't leave me here." My throat tightened. 2 apples now, both warm, both whispering in my own tired voice. I moved away quickly, stepping into the nearest row of trees. But the orchard felt narrower here. Branches arched lower overhead, crowding the space between trunks. The cold air pressed closer, thick and unmoving, as though the orchard itself was holding its breath. Then something fell behind me. 1 apple, then another, then a third. But they didn't hit the ground like normal fruit. They landed softly, as if lowered by gentle hands. Each one rolled to the center of the path before stopping perfectly still. I forced another breath into my lungs. There was no wind, no animals, nothing to knock them loose. I stepped closer to the nearest fallen apple, torch trembling in my grip. Its skin cracked, just a hairline fracture thin as a thread, but enough to let out a tiny escape of air, like a gasp held too long. The whisper from inside was even quieter this time, barely audible. I can't keep my eyes open. I staggered back. The orchard around me creaked. Not the trees, the ground. A low, subtle shift rolled through the soil, as though the earth beneath the orchard were adjusting itself, turning over, settling into a new shape. A cold sweat slid down my spine. Then behind me, closer than any voice should have been, a new whisper rose. "How long have you been awake?" I spun. The apple at my feet trembled. The trees around me leaned just slightly, impossibly toward me, and something deep within the orchard exhaled, tired and slow. The exhale drifted through the orchard like a long, weary sigh, moving between the trees in a shiver of cold air that didn't belong to the wind. It brushed the ends of my hair, slid down the back of my neck, and pooled around my ankles with a heaviness that reminded me of someone sitting on the edge of a bed too tired to lie down. I tightened my grip on the torch and scanned the dark rows. The trees seemed to lean a fraction closer. Branches arched together overhead, closing like heavy eyelids. Somewhere deeper in the orchard, an apple dropped. Not a fall, a placement. A soft thup, careful, deliberate, followed by the light roll of its round body settling into a comfortable position. Then another, and another. The sounds rippled outward, 1 row at a time, as though someone was moving through the trees and lowering apples onto the frost-kissed soil with gently cupped hands. I forced myself to move, stepping backward in small increments, keeping the nearest apples in my sight. The warm one at my feet tugged at the cold air, exhaling faintly, like a sleeper murmuring in their dreams. "Don't go yet." The whisper cracked with exhaustion. I felt it in my chest, in my own bones, because the voice didn't just sound like mine. It sounded like the version of me that hadn't slept in days, the version that lived at the edge of collapse. I turned away, heart hammering, and started down the central path that led toward the equipment shed. The rows seemed longer now, the orchard stretching on and on, as though adding trees to keep me within its reach. After 20 paces, I realized something was following me. A faint, rolling sound, a soft, rhythmic thump, 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 like a single apple bumping gently along the path. I spun. An apple sat in the center of the row, perfectly still. Another rested a meter behind it. Another sat to the left, half hidden in shadow, all warm-colored, all subtly trembling, all positioned as if watching me, or waiting. The silence pressed in tightly. Then the orchard breathed again. This time the sound wasn't a sigh, it was a slow, weary inhale, drawn through branches and soil alike. Every twig along the nearest trees quivered inward, as if pulled by an unseen tide. The air thickened in my lungs. My own breathing faltered, staggering to match the rhythm rising around me. When the exhale came, it spilled through the orchard with weight. Branches sagged, leaves loosened. Apples all around me rolled forward half a centimeter as though nudged by the breath of something enormous. They began whispering in response. Not one voice, many, all shaped like mind-strained, frayed at the edges, not quite able to hold themselves upright. I need rest. Please, just a moment. So tired. Don't leave me. Stay awake with me. The orchard trembled. The soil beneath my boots pulsed in a slow, sleepy rhythm, expanding, contracting like the ground itself was fighting to remain conscious. Branches creaked deeply overhead, not with the brittle snap of winter wood, but with a sound closer to joints cracking after holding the same position too long. My torch flickered. For a moment, all the sounds flattened into a single hum, a low, exhausted vibration that sank into my sternum, loosening my knees. Sleepiness washed through me so abruptly I staggered sideways, catching myself on a tree trunk. The bark under my palm felt warm, warmer than any tree had a right to be in winter frost. And then the tree shifted, not much, just a small sway toward me, as though leaning on me. A whisper slid from behind the trunk, riding on the breath of a nearby apple. I'm so tired. Let's rest together. I jerked away. The tree strained after me, its branches creaking in protest, like limbs reaching after someone trying to leave a bed too soon. My breathing came fast, now too fast, and the orchard copied it. Every apple inhaled, every branch flexed inward. The ground pulsed quicker. The air thickened with my own ragged rhythm. It was mimicking me. My fatigue, my weakness, my breath, and the more tired I felt, the stronger the orchard seemed to grow. I stumbled backward into another row and froze. Dozens of apples lined the soil before me, perfectly spaced in two curving arcs. They faced one another like the twin sides of a mouth. The arc ended at a larger tree whose branches hung low, heavy with fruit that didn't sway at all. The apples whispered in unison, "Lie down." Behind me, the orchard exhaled long, warm, patient, and the ground at my feet softened, just enough to suggest a place for me to rest. The ground softened so suddenly beneath my boots that my ankles nearly gave out. It didn't turn to mud or water, nothing dramatic like that. It became pliant, as though the soil had loosened itself just enough to cradle my weight, inviting me to sink, to settle, to stop fighting the heaviness pulling at my limbs. "No," I whispered, though my voice came out thin and shaky, like something already half asleep. The orchard reacted instantly. A ripple traveled through the nearest row of trees. Not wind, not movement from above, but a shiver that began at the roots and climbed the trunks in slow, brittle cracks. Branches twitched, adjusting their positions. Apples rolled an inch closer, aligning themselves with unsettling precision. The orchard was listening. More than that, it was responding. "Lie down," the apples murmured again, their voices layered with my own exhaustion, my own weaknesses, spoken back to me like echoes from a dream I didn't remember having. I forced myself upright, stepping back onto firmer ground. The soil resisted, clinging faintly to the soles of my boots, as if reluctant to let me go. The heavy tree at the end of the path shifted. I felt it before I saw it. A low, deep groan of strained wood pressed against wood, like a body moving after too many hours in the same position. Then the branches parted, slowly, delicately, as though something beneath them had inhaled and needed the limbs to open just enough to breathe. I raised my torch. Its beam slid over the bark, and the bark moved, a subtle stretch beneath the surface, barely noticeable unless you stared long enough. The slow expansion and release of something that wasn't wood at all, but the mimicry of breath. The tree was breathing. The fruits hanging from its limbs, hundreds of apples twitched faintly, their stems tightening like fingers curling. A few dropped, not randomly. They landed in a neat semicircle at the tree's base. They rolled toward me in unison, soft, measured, patient. Don't fight it. Rest. You're so tired. The orchard's whispering grew louder, drowning out the crunch of frost beneath my feet. Every apple around me vibrated gently, like small hearts tapping against fragile ribs. I stepped away, and the orchard stepped with me. Branches leaned, trunks angled, roots tightened beneath the soil. The movements weren't fast enough to catch the eye directly, but each time I looked again, the shapes around me had shifted, closing in, curling inward, forming a narrowing aisle that pushed me toward the heavy tree. It wanted me to lie down beneath it, and the worst part was how deeply that desire pulled at my exhausted bones. The orchard wasn't threatening me with fear. It was offering comfort, warmth, rest in a way that felt so desperately needed I could almost taste the relief. I shook my head hard. A mistake. My dizziness expanded instantly, a wave of sleep-bright haze washing over me, warming my cheeks, loosening my knees. The ground swayed. The trees wavered in sympathetic motion, as though sharing the same dreamy exhaustion. A single apple bumped into my heel. It whispered, breathlessly, "I never slept until you came." Something cold cracked open inside my skull. I stumbled forward into the curved path the trees had made. The ground softened further, a gentle cradle of soil that pushed up ever so slightly, helping me along. The heavy tree ahead waited, massive and patient, branches opening wider. A soft hum rose through the orchard. At first I thought it was wind, but the air was still. The hum grew, filling my ears, sinking into my chest, a lullaby built from hundreds of tired breaths. The apples trembled in time. The branches bowed. The orchard lowered itself, inch by inch, to meet me at the level of sleep. My eyelids fluttered, my vision blurred. I tried to lift my torch, but another apple rolled over my boot, pinning my foot gently, like a hand asking me not to move. Stay awake with us. Just a little longer. We're so tired. The heavy tree's trunk split slowly along a vertical seam, not breaking, but opening, revealing a hollow space lined with soft, pulsing fibers that expanded and contracted like a warm chest. A perfect resting place, prepared for me. I backed away blindly and struck something tall and rough. A tree, except it wasn't behind me before. Its bark shivered against my jacket. Branches lowered around my shoulders, like arms. The apple at my heel whispered a final, weary plea. Lie down, please. We need you to. The orchard exhaled as one, warm, heavy, sleep deep, and the ground opened beneath me just enough to receive a body. I lurched sideways, catching myself on a low branch before the softened earth could swallow my ankle. The soil beneath me pulsed again, one long, exhausted throb before settling back into stillness. It felt almost disappointed, almost hurt. I stumbled out of the tree's shadow, gulping air that suddenly felt clean again, untainted by the warm, breath-like drafts that had followed me through the orchard. For the first time since the whispers began, the rose seemed to loosen, branches lifting in a lazy sway like sleepers rolling over in bed. The orchard was settling. The apples stopped trembling. The ground stopped pulsing. The whispering fell away like a dream forgetting itself. Just silence. A cool, natural silence. I wiped my palms on my jacket, half afraid they would still feel the warmth of the apple's breath. But they were cold, numb, real. The heavy tree at the end of the path had closed its seam, bark meeting neatly once more. Branches hung motionless. The hollow warmth I had glimpsed inside was gone, as though it had never opened at all. For a moment, a brief, fragile moment, I wondered if exhaustion had tricked me, if I'd fallen half asleep on my feet and hallucinated the orchard leaning in to cradle me. I'd been tired these past weeks. Too many overnight shifts. Too many long walks home before dawn. Perhaps my mind had finally slipped. I turned in a slow circle. The orchard looked normal again. Just trees. Just winter fruit. Just a night too still for comfort. I forced myself to breathe deep, grounding breaths that smelled of frost and bark. My pulse slowed. The ache in my legs returned in a reassuringly human way. I could leave. I should leave. I stepped toward the main path, boots crunching on frost. The sound was sharp, familiar, blessedly mundane. That was when the apple near my foot rolled. Not toward me this time, but gently away, harmless. A shift caused by uneven ground or lingering tremors. I let out a shaky laugh, dry, embarrassed, almost relieved. The apple rolled to a stop. I turned away. Behind me, a faint pop sounded. Not loud, just the quiet snap of fruit gently falling into grass. Normal, I told myself. Normal. Halfway down the row, the orchard seemed to widen around me. The constriction I had felt earlier, the subtle sense of being guided, had evaporated. Rows aligned naturally again. The air felt thin and awake, untouched by the strange warmth that had clung to me before. My shoulders lowered. The tension drained. My steps grew steadier. When I reached the midpoint of the orchard, I paused to rest a moment. The moonlight caught the frost on the branches, turning them silver. It was almost beautiful, almost peaceful. A small apple lay nearby, not trembling, not warm, just an ordinary fallen fruit. I nudged it with my boot. It didn't whisper. It didn't roll back. It simply tipped onto its side, Relief washed through me slow, heavy, like warm water. I could make it to the shed, get off the grounds, call the supervisor, report something. I didn't know what yet, but anything was better than staying out here alone. The air shifted slightly, just enough for branches to sway. Wind. Finally, a normal wind. I almost smiled. I took another step and felt something soft give beneath my boot. Not soil, not grass, something round. I looked down. An apple, cracked open, its skin split in a gentle crescent, like eyelids peeling apart. Inside, nothing, just pale, empty flesh. But the inside was warm. I stumbled back. The cracked apple exhaled a long, relieved sigh and collapsed inward as if deflating. Every tree around me shifted, not leaning, not reaching, just relaxing. The same way a room exhales when someone finally lies down. A tired voice drifted from the orchard's center, soft, contented, barely audible. Thank you. My breath caught. I wasn't in danger, I realized with a creeping dread. Not exactly. The orchard wasn't trying to lure me into sleep. It was trying to sleep through me. The warmth in the cracked apple rose in a faint ripple through the soil, brushing the air around my knees. And the whisper that followed was fainter than the first, echoing from deeper in the rows, as if a chorus of tired things had just settled back into their beds. Don't go far. For a moment, nothing moved. The orchard held its silence like a long breath finally released, settling deeper into itself. The cracked apple at my feet softened further, its pale flesh collapsing inward in slow folds. Each collapse exhaled a faint warmth, like the afterbreath of someone sinking into deep sleep. I backed away slowly, careful not to disturb the soil that now seemed thin as fabric stretched over something breathing beneath it. Don't go far. The whisper rolled across the orchard, soft, coasting low along the grass, as though spoken from under a blanket. I froze mid-step. The air thickened around my legs, warm and foggy, like breath condensing in a small room. The orchard wasn't restraining me anymore. It was aware of the distance, tracking it. I turned toward the shed. Visible through the rows, a small rectangle of darkness. Its walls weren't safe, but they were away. And at that moment, away was enough. I tried to run. The orchard didn't grab me, didn't lash out, didn't close its rows or tilt its trees. It followed, not with movement, but with sound. A soft chorus rising from the ground, threading upward through the roots like tired breath forced through a narrow throat. 1, 2, 3, counting, not upward like the river, not rhythmic like the observatory, but slow, heavy, as though every increment cost energy. I forced my legs faster. The counting deepened. 4, 5. The air bent around the sound, thickening with the orchard's exhausted draw. Apples stirred in the grass, rolling lazily in the direction of my stride, as though pulled by the gravity of my distance. 6. That number hit the air like the groan of someone waking up in the wrong place. I felt the orchard shift. A low tremor hummed under the soil, not violent, just present, like something turning over beneath a quilt of roots. The ground darkened in patches as if moisture were rising to the surface. I stumbled, breath caught, and the orchard reacted instantly. 7. A quicker number, eager, The trees around me leaned, only slightly, but enough to release a faint rain of frost. It drifted toward me, not falling, but drifting sideways, following my movement like snow drawn by static. 8. I reached the shed's door and grabbed the handle. Frost bit my palm so sharply it burned, but the metal gave way. The door swung open with a brittle crack of old hinges. I slammed it behind me, throwing the bolt across. Darkness swallowed me whole. I pressed my back against the door, heart pounding so hard I felt dizzy. The shed smelled of soil, ropes, dry bark, ordinary things, comforting things. But outside, 9. The number seeped through the wooden slats. Warm. Close. I held my breath. The counting stopped. For a moment, the world narrowed to nothing but the windless quiet and the throb of blood behind my ears. Then something pressed against the wood behind me. Not a knock. Not a hit. A leaning. A tired, heavy weight settling its full body against the shed wall. The way someone exhausted leans into another person for support. The wood bowed slightly behind my spine. Warmth seeped through, and a whisper so soft it nearly dissolved in my hair murmured, "Stay, just stay." I gritted my teeth and pushed off the door. The shed walls creaked in response. A tired lament. I searched the space frantically. Shelves, tools, old tarps. A small window too narrow to climb through. Nothing that would help me escape. The whisper outside shifted, becoming many whispers, layered faintly atop one another. "Please, don't leave us. We rest better when you're near." The shed floor trembled. A thin line of soil at the baseboard darkened and pulsed outward, creeping like a shadow, stretching its limbs. I stumbled backward until I hit a stack of wooden crates. Dust billowed. The orchard inhaled. The sound of the breath slow, laborious filled the shed from all sides, pressing against the walls with a weight that felt like 100 bodies lying down around me. Something thumped against the shed roof. Once, twice, then rolled slowly. An apple. It stopped directly above where I stood. Cracks splintered through the roof's thin shingles, tiny fractures, but spreading, like fingers pressing from above. I grabbed a nearby shovel. The metal was cold, heavy. I edged toward the door. Outside, the soil shifted again. Roots pushed upward thin, questing shapes curling under the doorframe like the fingertips of someone feeling for a dropped key. The whispers merged into one, rising in a single weary sigh. "Sleep with us." The floor dipped beneath me. A circular depression formed, subtle at first, then deepening rapidly, as though the shed itself were sinking into a hollow dug for me. No, not for the shed. For me. I lunged, slamming the shovel's blade under the window frame and wrenching upward. The wooden plank snapped. Cold air spilled in. Not orchard warm, real cold. Crisp. Natural. I climbed. Roots scraped against my boots. Desperate. Like hands too tired to grip. Apples rolled across the shed roof, dropping and landing with dull, exhausted thuds. "Don't go." The whisper cracked, trembling. I dragged myself through the narrow opening. My coat tore. My knee scraped on a splintering plank, but I burst out into the open night, lungs expanding with air that didn't taste of warm breath. I hit the ground and ran. Behind me, the shed shuddered as the orchard sagged against it, a forest collapsing into a deeper sleep, disappointed, murmuring faintly, "Come back." We can't rest. Without you, the ground didn't chase me. The trees didn't rise. They only whispered, only begged, only counted my footsteps fading. When I reached the far fence, I turned once. The orchard stood utterly still, branches drooping, apples settled. The entire grove looked like a body curled within itself, exhausted, and from somewhere deep within, almost too faint to hear, drifted one last number, heavy, longing, half-conscious, 10, not counting up, counting away, counting the distance between us as I escaped. I didn't stop running until the orchard was a dark smear behind me. Branches folded into a silhouette that looked more like a sleeping creature than a grove of trees. The night air, cold and honest, stung my lungs. Each breath felt sharp, but real, untainted by the orchard's warmth. For a long moment, I allowed myself to believe I had truly left it behind. The fence buzzed faintly under my palm as I steadied myself. Frost coated the wire in thin crystals. Normal, beautiful, safe. I turned onto the gravel path that led back to the research station and took my first steady step in what felt like hours. The ground didn't pulse. Nothing whispered. No apples rolled after me. Just the wind. I reached the crest of the path and made the mistake of glancing back. The orchard had not moved, but something about it had changed. Its shape seemed tighter, contracted. The branches hung heavier, not shifting. Listening, I shuddered and forced myself forward. One step, then another. The wind brushed the back of my coat. A simple, ordinary breeze. But the breeze hesitated, then blew again. Warmer. Not orchard warm. Not human warm. Familiar warm. My warm. I froze. The wind behind me exhaled again, matching my breath exactly. Pace for pace. Depth for depth. Shaking slightly the way my own breath did when fear still clung to the ribs. Slowly, terrified, I turned. The orchard hadn't moved, but the trees nearest its edge, their branches were lifted, reaching upward, aligned in a pattern I didn't recognize at first. Then I did. Branches arranged like ribs, curved, evenly spaced. A perfect mirror of the shape of my chest as I had stood there minutes ago, panting, terrified, alive. The orchard wasn't counting distance anymore. It was copying my breathing again, learning the shape of me without me. And then, from deep inside the sleeping grove, a whisper stirred, drifting through branches that hadn't moved at all. 11. The orchard wasn't sleeping. It was dreaming me. As the night grows quieter, listener, let your breath soften, and let the darkness settle gently around you. These stories were only fragments, shadows of larger things that still move, still wait, still whisper where we cannot see. If your room feels a little different now, if the air seems to hold its breath for a moment, don't worry. Sometimes the world listens more closely after a story is told. Rest well tonight. Let your eyes fall heavy. And if something follows you softly into sleep, don't turn. Just let it pass. I'll be here in the next story, waiting for you in the dark. Good night.